Chapter 19. Escape. My hand shot up to cover my mouth. It was David, my brother. I had finally found him.
"This is my brother, David,"
I stammered.
Did he always have the arm?
Diane questioned. I ignored her. I gently slapped David's face.
"David, wake up. It's me. Aubrey, it's your little sister."
I croaked. David didn't reply or open his eyes. He was taking shallow breaths, but his skin was clammy and pale. He was alive, at least.
He must have recognized you when you first approached the tank. That's why he was trying to break out.
Seth reckoned.
And Diane's taunting gave him the extra push to escape.
Seth said, sounding exhausted.
"We have to get him out of here."
I begged the others. John motioned to Seth.
"Seth, you take him.
He said softly.
We'll get him out of here."
A thin smile crept across his face.
This is better than a personnel file, eh?
Without speaking, Seth removed his jacket and draped it over David's shoulders. He hoisted my brother onto his own shoulder.
"Let's get out of here,"
he muttered. We hurried back out the door from where we originally entered the lab. As we exited, the automatic door slammed shut behind us. We had found what we were looking for, so there was no longer any need to take our time and investigate each door and window. It was time to make our way out of the underground bunker and leave Fort Romcon as fast as possible. As we hurried back toward the control room and warehouse, a loud rumble shook the hallway.
Rosid! Did you accidentally hit the detonator?
Diane cursed. I held up the controller she had moments ago carelessly tossed to me.
"No, of course not,"
I objected. The four of us turned and peered back down the hallway toward the lab. The automatic door slid open. A wave of liquid gushed out into the hallway. It was more liquid from the tanks, which could only mean one thing: more monsters. A heavy mass of flesh slid out into the corridor. An army of writhing arms clawed at the floor, walls, and ceiling, dragging itself along. The blob struggled to slide its immense mass down the hallway toward us. It was nearly as large as the entire hallway, and it was headed our way. It was slow, but not so slow that we could afford to ignore it.
That's the ugliest one yet,
exclaimed Diane. She lifted her submachine gun and started spraying bullets at the wall of flesh and gnashing limbs.
John, you and Seth go check the door back to the warehouse,
Diane ordered.
"Seth, take care of my brother,"
I begged. Seth nodded at me. He and John sprinted down the hall back to the control room.
Rosid, back me up here,
Diane barked. I switched my weapon back to rapid fire and joined Diane in launching a hail of bullets down the hall at the approaching mass. The bullets whizzed through the air and sank into the monster's flesh with a sickening squish. The arms continued to heave the body forward. There was no discernible head to aim for, and the body was soaking up bullets like a sponge. With each lurch forward the creature took, Diane and I took a step backward toward the end of the hall. We continued to shoot at the monster, but we were losing ground.
This isn't working,
hissed Diane through gritted teeth.
John, is the door open yet?
She yelled down the hall. John poked his head back into the hallway.
The key card we took from the scientist worked on the door. It's open. Hurry, and let's get out of here.
He shouted back.
You heard him, let's go,
motioned Diane. The two of us started running back to the control room. Just like John had said, the door was open, and the way back into the empty warehouse where this had all started for me, all those years ago, was clear. John and Seth were already waiting on the other side of the door. John had his hand held up in the doorway like he was holding an elevator door for a late coworker. We cleared the threshold, but we weren't safe just yet. The blob beast was not as swift or agile as some of the others we had encountered thus far, but it was still gaining on us at an uncomfortable pace.
Close the door,
Diane squealed at John while waving her hands at the door. John let his hand drop from the doorway. The heavy door could block off the beast chasing us, but the door didn't close. The deadly portal hung open. The squelching sound of wet flesh dragging on the concrete floor was growing louder. The slapping sound of a mass of inhuman hands was getting closer. I kicked the door frame. It responded by angrily slamming shut just as the creature reached the control room. The sound of dozens of furious fists thundered against the closed door. It held, however, and eventually, the pounding trailed off and stopped entirely. We all breathed a heavy sigh of relief. We had all managed to escape the laboratory and re-enter the warehouse relatively unscathed, but our haggard band had little time to rest and regroup. We wouldn't be safe until we left this cursed bunker. The darkness at the edges of the dimly lit warehouse pressed against us. The corpse of the gorilla monster Seth had killed only hours before had already begun to rot and stink. These monstrosities were held together by the fickle needle and thread of science, and nature was happy to take them apart again.
Let me see him.
I motioned to Seth. Seth knelt and let my brother, David, gently slide off of his shoulders and onto the ground. David's eyes were still closed and his breathing was still weak, but after leaving the tank of unknown fluid, the color in his face and skin started to rush back in. Maybe there was a chance that he would wake up and walk out of this place side by side with me and the rest of our ragtag band. I tugged the jacket Seth had thrown onto him tighter around his body. David was thinner and his cheeks were not as full as I remember, but he looked healthy enough considering what he had been through. He looked mostly normal too. Normal, except for his left arm. It was longer than his normal human arm as the clawed arm hung past his knees. The hand resembled a human one too, but it was a little too large to pass as completely ordinary. But an oversized hand wasn't the only problem. Instead of rounded half-moon fingernails, David's fingers were tipped with sharp bear-like claws. The arm itself, besides being too long, was streaked with a patchwork of different textures and colors. The skin looked soft, pink, and human in some places. In others, it looked reptilian and scaly. I dragged the tips of my fingers down the skin of David's unnatural arm. My fingers were met with the warm and familiar sensation of reaching out to touch a loved one, but were occasionally interrupted by the rough alien skin of something inhuman. I felt thin streams of hot tears begin to run down my face. The tears were flowing, but I was not crying. There wasn't time for it. I would let the tidal wave of relief wash over me after we were somewhere safe. There would be time to cry later. There would be time to weep when we were safe. I stood and wiped my face with my sleeve.
This is my brother David,
I repeated.
He's alive.
His arm?
Seth said flatly. He didn't smirk or have any traces of coldness in his tone.
They experimented on him here.
I croaked.
They must have used him up and tossed him in that glass prison after he served his purpose.
Diane and John shot each other a knowing look, but I didn't have time to question them about it.
They kept him around and alive, though. There must have been a reason.
Diane stated. John bent down at the hip and looked into my eyes with his typical kind expression.
It's best not to linger. We'll have time to talk when we get back to our base at the underground,
he advised. I took a deep breath and let the air leave my lungs slowly. Seth, will you carry him for me? I'm not strong enough to lift him, I muttered. I hated to have to ask for help from Seth. He nodded.
I got him.
Seth bent down and gingerly picked David up and placed him back over his shoulders. Watching Seth handle my brother made him seem so light and delicate. I hoisted myself to my feet and slapped at the dust that hung heavy in the air.
We have two options,
I started.
We can go back out the way we came.
I gestured to the door and hallway we had used to enter the warehouse.
Or we can go that way,
I finished, pointing to the other door leading out of the warehouse.
I see no reason why we can't go back the way we came in,
John proposed. I let out a sigh of relief. There was no end to the bad memories in this place. If we had chosen the latter option and headed through the other door, I would have had to pass by the place where I fell into a puddle of one of my former comrades' blood all those years ago. I shuddered. Diane held up her hands in warning.
Rosid, don't hit that detonator until we are clear of the fort. I know those bombs we set up looked small, but they pack a punch.
She warned, pumping a fist in the air. Despite her warning, I could tell she was fond of explosives. I rolled the detonator around in my hand, testing its weight. It felt like power. It felt like control. I would be glad to bury this place once and for all. We exited the warehouse and started back down the hall toward the exit. Hopefully, our exit from this wretched place wouldn't be as difficult as the entry. The thought barely had time to form before I was proved wrong. A heavy steel blast door blocked the way from which we had come.
Was that there when we got here?
Diane asked sarcastically.
It's new.
I grumbled.
It seems we aren't out of it yet.
Sighed John. That left only one choice for exiting the bunker. We had to take the long way around. We were going to have to go through the passage that had been stained with the blood of one of my friends. I looked over at Seth. I tightened my grip on my gun. I turned and headed back to the warehouse and to our only other option for exiting the bunker.
Come on.
I said wearily. We hurried back through the warehouse without stopping. But when we entered the hallway, we slowed to a steady walk. We hadn't been through here before, so there was no telling what surprises were lurking down this hallway. Not to mention that every step brought me closer to that spot.
Rosid, are you feeling okay?
Asked John. In truth, I was far from okay. I knew I needed to stay alert. At any moment, a new monstrosity could pop out from anywhere, but I found it hard to focus on my current situation. I was too busy mentally preparing myself for seeing the spot where everything had started to fall apart for me.
Yeah, I'm okay.
I lied. I led on, John and Diane directly behind me, walking side by side. Seth was at the rear, still carrying my brother. Finally, we reached the intersection of corridors. We had to take the right turn to come back around and exit the underground base. The other pathways led deeper into the bunker and away from the fresh air and sunlight. I took a deep breath and rounded the corner. I half shut my eyes, worried I would see the old bloodstains from where Seth killed one of my friends. But I didn't see what I was most dreading. I didn't see blood staining the floor and walls faded by the passage of time. What I found instead was far worse and something I didn't expect. A man was leaning against the wall, smoking a cigarette at the exact spot where I had fallen in a pool of my friend's blood. He took a long drag on his cigarette and looked over casually in the direction of our group. He didn't look surprised to see a group of people running through the underground military bunker. He looked almost bored.
It's good to see you two again.
The man exhaled through a cloud of smoke. It had been years since I had seen this man, but I didn't have any trouble recognizing him. He wasn't in his dress uniform. Instead, he wore standard fatigues that any soldier would wear when deployed into the field. Despite that, he had the same expertly styled black hair and hungry, vulture-like eyes. It was Brigadier General Huxley, and he was here waiting for us.